Table fellowship is a mark of Jesus' ministry and a major point of contention with his grumpy enemies. Today's account of the feeding of the 5,000 carries Jesus' penchant for eating together into a picnic setting. The event must have captivated the imagination of the early church because we find the miracle in all four Gospels. The disciples play an interesting role in the story from the start. Their old sinful nature tells them that this is not the time or place to pull off a picnic. With compassion fatigue, the disciples want to send the crowds away and fend for themselves. And do you blame them? Perhaps they also have the ulterior motive of protecting Jesus' need for solitude and protecting their own need for privileged fellowship with him apart from the common people. But Jesus sees this as a teaching moment for his disciples as he commands them to give these persons something to eat. You give them something to eat. Apparently, the disciples anticipated that Jesus would not cut them some slack here, so they reported the meager supply available: 5 loaves and 2 fish. The disciples see this situation as a never-enough problem. Jesus responds to them by inviting them to bring what they have forward. And he proceeds to bless, break, and distribute the loaves in the cadence of the words that point forward to the Last Supper at the end of the Gospel. Jesus, starting with gratitude for the available portion of 5 loaves and 2 fish, facilitates the abundant growth of these provisions into a magnanimous act of hospitality for guests who have little to offer in return. Matthew makes it clear that all are fed. In a wonderful understatement, Matthew adds there were 5,000 men, not even counting the women and children. And oh yes, by the way, there were 12 baskets full left over. The gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. Beloved of God, you bet. This is the gospel of the Lord. It is an astounding tale of how God translates never enough into plenty for everybody. It is an amazing account of how God works through stingy disciples to make them agents of overwhelming grace and provision. The gospel of the Lord moves us from a mindset of deficiency to one of sufficiency by providing a counter-narrative of compassion and connection for all the people there. Jesus is abundant. With Jesus, abundance wins. Theologian and counselor Parker Palmer sees this story as an illustration of our scarcity assumption being overcome by the abundance reality of God's economy of grace. Palmer illustrates this truth by telling a story of the time he had flown into a Canadian city for a weekend speaking engagement and then boarded for the return flight the following Monday with many of the same passengers and crew. The takeoff was delayed considerably, and somehow the expected food and beverages had not arrived before taxiing out onto the runway. The hungry, tired, and already late passengers quickly became hangry to the point of rebellion. Into this deteriorating situation, as Palmer tells the story, stepped in a take-charge, canny and funny flight attendant who immediately calmed the crowd by saying something to the effect of, "Listen up. Now, I was working the flight in on Friday afternoon, and I know that many of you put those extra bags of peanuts and pretzels I gave you into your pockets. And I know that some of you have brought with you this morning some fruit sandwiches and bottles of water for the flight. So let's all break them out and, like we were taught in kindergarten, share with one another." The miracle wasn't simply that the passengers began to do just as she said, but that in the process of sharing what they had, began chatting with one another, smiling and becoming a true, if temporary, community there on the plain, all enabled and encouraged by that savvy flight attendant. Palmer, something of a guru in leadership training circles, winked at the flight attendant on the way out and said, "Nice job." She grinned back, nodded, and said, "You know the story of the feeding of the 5,000, don't you?" Abundance wins. Let me share another story even closer to home this morning. Thanks to a grant initiated by our very own Eric Stark, our congregation receives 500 loaves of bread each week from Ivan's house. Each week, someone gets the 500 loaves to the Northeast Homeless Action Group, where each loaf makes 10 sandwiches. From that, 5,000 sandwiches get distributed to the homeless in Bristol, Camden, and Kensington. Yes, each week, 5,000 persons receive sandwiches through this important ministry. You see, every week we witness the feeding of the 5,000 in the localities within our parish's concern. The gospel of the Lord. Praise to you,